that's valid. That poverty magnifies the symptoms, right?
Mhm.
Um, I was just thinking about, I tend to be pretty transparent about some of my childhood, which a portion of my childhood was spent in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Very low socioeconomic status, and a variety of circumstances that, would contribute to some pretty high ACEs, which, for those who don't know, is adverse childhood experiences. Thank you all for joining me here on the Just Live podcast, featuring yours truly, Queen Sanaa. I have a special episode for you today. I have a special guest, and we are going to talk about some real important, very heavy stuff today. So, I am looking forward to talking to you after I hydrate. That's the alkaline water. Quick plug, y'all. Alkaline water for the win. But back to what I was saying, we have a very special episode for you today because today we are going to talk about how poverty affects children. And I'm going to focus on young children just a bit because I believe in the importance of making sure children have what they need during the early childhood years, the years when certain experiences are imprinted and they affect a child all the way through to adulthood. We're going to get into that some more as well. But my special guest today is Letitia Huger Hill from Positive Redirection. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring her in so that we can have this awesome discussion.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Children and poverty.
Yeah.
What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear those two words together?
The first thing that comes to mind when I hear children, poverty, um, I hear wondering about lack of opportunity, you know, um, lack of access to care. On the other side of that, I also think about resilience. And so there's a lot of different things that come to mind when thinking about poverty in children, specifically not based off just what we see on TV or what we see from the outside, but also what we've experienced from knowing others that have been in poverty, being in close proximity, growing up with others that may have been in poverty. I think what a lot of people think sometimes when they think about poverty is a place, that poverty resides in a place, but poverty is kind of dispersed out, that a lot of people don't understand. And we think poverty looks a certain way when it looks different for everybody. Mhm.
I agree. I know that there was a lot of talk about the stimulus that went out for families when we were all in the house several years ago. Uh, and what happened was there were accesses that families had that once they lost that particular access, the child poverty rate tripled in certain places. I was looking at some data. We don't have to get into the data yet. Okay. Uh, what do you want to say about the way poverty affects a child's thinking, the way it affects their mind?
Yeah, there's a it's a two part. it's a two-way street where poverty affects your mental health, and mental health also impacts the risk factors associated with poverty and things. It definitely has an effect on the well-being of children when it comes to the risk factors that are involved when we think about poverty. So we have things such as the lack of access to food, lack of access to different medical care, lack of access to not just because they go to school, but there's lack of access to pro social activities, being able to have, outlets such as after school programs and things like that because of the areas not using the funding the way it needs to be used in order to serve the communities and things. And so it definitely has an impact just in how you think and how you perceive the world around you. And so child depression is going to be increased. Childhood anxiety, social anxiety is going to be increased. A lot of times we look at aggression as something that, oh, you're aggressive because of, but all the other factors that go along with that, not being able to sleep comfortably, not being able to have the amount of calories that you need. Sure, you're eating, but are you eating enough to not feel these different effects? So it does have an impact on your well-being.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I like how you said a lot of times the schools, they don't necessarily allocate it towards what's best for these children. I found a visual that kind of gives an idea about what children experience internally when they're going through poverty. And if you all are looking at that, we're looking at fewer opportunities, feelings of worthlessness,
Mm-hmm.
hopeless, social insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And I never even considered what children are going through when they're worried about the parents. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
mom, dad doesn't have a job, or, mom, dad can't pay the bills, and just lots of different things here. If you take a look at that, all of the viewers. And so in my research, I found a site that stated, truly resonated with me. It says poverty negatively affects a child's um, physical and social emotional development. It shortens life expectancy. It frustrates the quality of life. It undermines their beliefs and it worsens their attitudes and behavior. So, the thought that I had from that was that all the so called bad kids in the inner city and in the rural, underserved areas, they really have valid underlying factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you consider that there are over 10 million children in the United States under the age of 18, below the poverty line, it would seem that a lot of the issues that they face in school, the root cause is really something that needs to be dealt with on a larger scale, maybe even on a systems level, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, what is your personal experience, whether professionally, in the home, in your neighborhood, with people that you've interacted with in the workspace? What is your experience with child poverty?
I would say when I was working probably earlier in my career, where I had the opportunity to um, go into the homes of different people that have different issues, right? And so during this time, when I was working in research, we went from going into homes that were um, in various socioeconomic statuses, right? And so I've been in the homes where the children were from well to do, well off, high income families where poverty wasn't the issue, down to the middle class where You just kind of are in that space. You're not qualifying for the to say that you are living in poverty, but you're also not with the well-to-do, so to speak, households. And then we have the families that are in poverty, that are, having issues with housing, having issues with enough food for all the children in the home, um, all these different things. And I think what was interesting is they had the same issues, right? They experienced the issues of feeling depressed, feeling anxious, and all these different things, but the ability to navigate through it, have the support, was the biggest differences, right? And so I think just in my experience with working with various areas, various socioeconomic sectors or spaces, and seeing uh, the same symptoms, the same issues, but the recovery and all of the risk factors and all of the different things that have to be taken into account in order to address the same issue. You know what I mean? And so someone who's experiencing depression may look different based off of what you have access to. What are the additional risk factors that are there that really magnifies your symptoms? And I think the biggest thing with poverty is the fact that it magnifies symptoms.
Yeah, that's uh that's valid. That poverty magnifies the symptoms, right? Um, I was just thinking about. I tend to be pretty transparent about some of my childhood, which a portion of my childhood was spent in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Very low socioeconomic status and a variety of circumstances that would contribute to some pretty high ACEs, which, for those who don't know, is adverse childhood experiences. There is a questionnaire online. If you're interested, I will put the link in the show notes for you to find out what your ACEs score is. Um, and I think about some of the experiences that we had access to, such as going to the opera or, different events on the pier in the city or Radio City Music Hall as a young person, which a lot of those things kind of transport you to a different world in so many ways. They take you outside of the circumstances that you find yourself in. But then there were a lot of children in those communities that didn't have those accesses, that didn't see anything outside of what was outside the front door, which on any given day could be anything. A junkie sleeping on the porch, crack balls. It was the 80s, crack balls, in the playground, and just a variety of things that really do shape a child's perspective about their world around them. There's an agency that we interviewed on the New Neighborhood podcast called The Power of Two. And they do work actually in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And we talked on the New Neighborhood podcast, which is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. I am the co-host of season 2 and 3, and I will also drop that link in the show notes as well. But the conversation we had was about how you could have two completely different families in the Brownsville area who had two completely different sets of circumstances, but still in the same environment where certain accesses weren't available, and how those circumstances contributed to different outcomes for the children from each family. And I think that that's really important because that takes me to the space where poverty can be considered a mindset. And that is not to invalidate actual impoverished circumstances, but definitely to shed light on the thinking and the locus of control and a person's ability to kind of add or subtract from the circumstances that they're experiencing. So, do you want to talk a little more about that and what that looks like?
Yeah. And I think too, that goes back to what I had mentioned that people think poverty is a place, that you can go to a specific place and say that's poverty, right? And I was right next door in East New York, Brooklyn, where Brownsville is here, East New York is across the boulevard kind of deal, So we had that experience of, being in a place where outsiders coming in would think something different. But my experience living in East New York, Brooklyn, can be different from my neighbors in a different building, or even in the same building, different floor. You know what I mean? And so I think that it kind of gives you a sense of respect for people. You know what I mean? And it really takes you outside of looking at someone who may be in poverty and really looking at it as what really is poverty, because when we Google it, it's really about how many people live in your house and how much how much money you make, right? And that determines poverty, right? And so if we're looking at just North Carolina, we have about, I think, 1.3 million people that live in poverty in North Carolina. And out of that, I think a little bit under 400,000 are children and things. And we look at that and we think, well, what do they look like? What does somebody in poverty look like? And we stereotype people, and we feel like they have a less than, you know, experience in the world, or just in their environment, and that couldn't be further from the truth. You know what I mean? So I think that, when we look at the experiences, even different people that are in the same socioeconomic status, if they are both living in poverty, each person has a different experience. You know what I mean? Based off of factors that they have, based off of access that they have to friends and different people that have different things. People feel that someone who's living in poverty shouldn't ever go on a cruise. But if you know someone who works for a cruise company and they say, hey, I have this opportunity for you, does that person not deserve that experience? Or are you shocked that they had that experience? So that's what I think about when I think about the different experiences, is to not, for people to not be judgmental, to assume that this label means that your life is this way. Now it doesn't take away the fact that there's still a need for access to care and access to, all the other things that everyone should have at baseline. You know what I mean? But it does kind of help to not assume that, there is a turn your nose up kind of situation, because everybody's experience is different. Mm-hmm.
And that's classism anyway, right?
Right.
I'm not going to lie to you. It always chaps my ass. And I hear people say things like, they get food stamps. Why are they buying a steak or lobster tails or because
It's
that's what they want.
it's gonna
Like,
go back.
what are they supposed to buy? Are they supposed to buy like boxed food? And you know what I
Right.
mean? Like,
You can't eat fresh foods. Like, what? It's not a
and
thing. That's
then
I thought.
let's just talk about this. When we talk about having to stretch $1 to make a meal, why is it that the healthy food costs so much more than the stuff that comes in boxes, and the stuff with all the dyes and the chemicals and the stuff that makes kids crazy?
Right.
Let's they gonna get me for saying that, but hey, listen, we gotta speak the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. It should be cheaper
Let's
because
talk
you
about
have to get
that.
out of the store faster. So you would think the shelf
That's
life
what I'm
is,
saying. That's what I'm
Mhm.
saying. Let's give that stuff to the people who can afford health insurance.
Not okay.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
do agree with that. There's this coalition called the ABC Coalition. It's the Automatic Benefits Coalition, and that's where a lot of agencies and supporters get together and they rally for this automatic child tax credit, which has been proven to pull hundreds of thousands, if not more, families out of poverty. Just like I said, by having that little bit of access to a little extra cash, which means they have access to vegetables instead of something that doesn't have any type of nutritional value, right?
Mhm.
And there are people who immediately block it without even trying to find out what it actually means. There are people who say they support it and in darkness actually don't. They block it. There are people who don't block it but don't feel comfortable supporting it out loud. And then there are people who absolutely do support making sure that children don't have to experience poverty. And I personally, I just have a lot of challenges with someone who goes, they don't need to eat things that are good for them. They don't need to have, access to experiencing the city in a way that someone who already has the privilege does. They don't need that. Let them suffer. What what do
Yeah.
you make of that?
I think it comes down to a lack of knowledge of how impactful experiences are in life. You know what I mean? And it's one of those things where I think it's underestimated the impact of getting out of your comfort zone is. And even as adults, we push that, come outside of your comfort zone, do this, do this, do this. But with children, we kind of feel like they wouldn't benefit from that. And especially when we're thinking about just the history of the thoughts and feelings of children, that's been discredited for years, for decades.
Yeah,
And it's really just now a thing where people are now seeing that children experience the world the way adults experience the world, and it impacts them. You know what I
yeah,
mean? And I think that, there isn't enough knowledge of allowing children to know that coming outside of your comfort zone can break a cycle, because this is what you know. And if you are coming outside of that, that there's something different. You only know something different if you actually leave. I know in growing up in New York City, a lot of families are from the South, right? Or a
hmm
lot of families are from different parts of the countries, like Puerto Rico or Jamaica, and you
yeah.
know have
West
those.
Indies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you have that is really a protective factor when it comes to living in certain spaces and growing up in certain spaces, because you have that comparison to know I'm here, but that exists. There's so many people that have lived in their neighborhoods and never left within a 5 mile radius all their life,
Yeah,
because when you have everything you so called need in your neighborhood, you don't have family
violent.
outside of the neighborhood. Where are you going?
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah,
mean? And so I think that's another aspect too, is just not knowing the impact of coming outside of your comfort zone. It
yeah.
definitely has an impact.
It definitely broadens your worldview and
Mhm.
definitely allows you to see that there's more than just what's right here, right?
Mhm.
I like how you said that children experience the world the way adults do because, yes, and they don't have the ability to process or
Mhm.
control those circumstances that they're experiencing. They don't have the power to do that as children. And I was thinking about ACEs. I mentioned ACEs earlier because a lot of the time when children are experiencing ACEs, it's a result of the adults in their lives and their decisions. So, for
Mhm.
example, maybe somebody did give you a cruise ticket, but maybe you spent the light bill money to buy clothes for the cruise or buy the plane tickets for the cruise. And now the kids don't have food and the lights are off type deal. Or Uh, Maybe the adult in the household is frustrated because they lost their job and now they are brutalizing the child, right? So the child has to not only deal with not having the financial accesses, but also the results of what impoverished circumstances do to adults and their mindsets and the way they parent, et cetera, right? So when I was thinking about ACEs, I just wanted to talk about the correlation between experiencing those situations, the lack of accesses, and then those adverse experiences that result from low wages, food insecurity, incarceration, and all the other things that come, with poverty. I just want to talk about what's the correlation between those and uh, the choices a child makes as an adult after going through all that. I want to make sure I'm wording that right.
Mm-hmm.
Life after impoverished childhood. What does that
Mm-hmm.
look like?
As far as the like the outcomes of child growing up and then now they're an adult, but their experience, okay, yeah, yeah. I think that the biggest thing is when you mention ACEs, just the effect of trauma on on a child's brain, right? And that's why child mental health is such a big deal, because the idea is if we can work with the children, then that will help them once they are adults to be healthy adults that will then go on to create their own families and break the pattern of what happens from childhood to adulthood. Now, it is a very impactful thing when it comes to adverse child experiences and things, because it changes how you react to your environment. Where it could be something like someone can tap you on the shoulder and it feels like they're trying to take your arm out the socket. You know what I mean? And so being able to have children in the space, and even not just with mental health professionals, because what I usually will tell people, mental health and specifically therapy is one of many interventions, right? And so the answer is not always therapy. Sometimes the answer is the coach of the basketball or the soccer team, or that teacher or that resource room, or that principal or that pastor or that volunteer that comes in every other month or something like that. Therapy is one of many resources, but there's so many others that can also help children um, to thrive through their adolescent years. Now, a lot of times adults who have experienced trauma and adults who have had a really, not even just not even trauma, because everyone who experiences trauma isn't necessarily traumatized, you know what I mean? But people who have experienced that, I think it's important to really understand that it usually started really young. It really started when they were beginning to form trusting relationships with adults and form their worldview and be in touch with, how to engage with others, So there definitely is an impact. If it isn't addressed, the needs of children isn't addressed, and how that impacts them as adults, it affects everything: their parenting, their work, their relationships. It affects it all.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so I was thinking, okay, so I have a really high ACEs score. On the original questionnaire that had 8, I had 8. Some of them now have 10 or more. People like to tweak things, but neither here nor there. It's really high. Now I look at my life and I look at the things that I'm able to do, right? That I maybe never imagined back then that I'll be doing because of what things look like, right? And then I'm like, okay, well, there has to be more to it than just, you have these experiences and you don't have a lot, and then you grow up and you still don't have a lot and you can't do nothing and you don't have any, what's the word, belief in yourself and what you can do. I know there's a better word for that, but it escapes me right now. So I did a little digging, Letitia, and I was looking at ACEs, and I was looking at how to heal from ACEs. And what I realized is that there are a lot of initiatives nationally and locally that really do a lot of work in regard to healing from ACEs. And so I think that there's a lot of value in leaning into some of those things that you could do. And I heard how you mentioned therapy, and then you said, but therapy is not the only thing. And I totally agree with you. I was looking at this list that was talking about healing from ACEs. And one of the main things it said to do was, hey, take the questionnaire so that you can actually acknowledge what it was that contributed to those traumas. And no, you may not be traumatized, but it does feed your internal script. It does feed your internal narrative, your experiences. It happens. And then when you recognize and you realize, then you can start to kind of fix those I guess, reframe those building blocks, right? To look like something different. So it said to take the quiz. Another thing that it said to do was write. So journaling or writing songs, right? Or writing stage plays. I know a lot of people put their experiences into stage plays and television shows, etc. Right? One of the things that it said was to practice mindfulness. So I don't know. We can get into that a little bit, but I'm going to finish going down the list. It mentioned yoga with the centering and all of that. It mentioned EEG neurofeedback to learn how your experiences affect your neurological processing, which I will say there is information to support that certain traumas at a young age tend to affect your emotional IQ and your emotional age and your developmental age as well. I didn't know that. We'll talk about that too in a minute. Another thing that it lists is EMDR, which is a really good trauma technique. It really helps with PTSD and other traumas people have experienced. And finally, it says to rally community healing, which I think is a really big deal, especially when I think about the community I grew up in Brownsville. Certain efforts I know would have helped to heal the community and kind of change the outcomes for a lot of people who grew up in those communities. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let you jump in and talk about the ones that kind of stood out and that you strongly support and why you think it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm. I think they all kind of, definitely everything is beneficial. And one of the things that I do whenever I'm doing therapy with adults and things is I start with the end in mind, right? And so I never want my clients to be dependent on me. I want them to understand that I am a part of a bigger picture. And one of the things that is important in terms of the community aspect is having a support system. And usually, people who have a support system have a higher rate of healing consistently, right? So, and when I say consistently, I mean throughout the whole process. So when I say the end in mind, it can be a year, you know what I mean? And so it's not like come in and leave, but during this time, the biggest part is the community and how people engage with the community if you don't necessarily have a support system. Because the reality is, some people have unhealthy relationships, and that's the only relationships they have. And sometimes it's a matter of rebuilding your community, you know, one person at a time, whether it's maintaining boundaries with certain people or maintaining loyalties to certain entities that we may be a part of. All these different things play a role in how we heal. So I think if I'm going to think of the one that stood out for me the most would be the community piece, because deep down everyone wants to feel purpose. What that looks like is different for each person, and sometimes it's just helping people to identify what their purpose is and to create meaning behind where they are right now. And so I think the community part is the one that stood out to me the most from the list that you mentioned. Hmm. Yeah.
I like that. It kind of reminds me of all the Stop the Violence rallies, where they do the block parties. Oh, do people really do block parties anymore? But they did all the block parties, and, the artists would come out and, do their thing, and the whole community was excited. And then they would go back to the same situation, the same circumstances, and then it would be the same stuff all over again. So I do support rallying the community and kind of getting that community buy-in so that people can really feel a sense of ownership to that cause and changing their circumstances together. You know, I support that. And I do also want to talk about the hope after ACEs as well, because I think it's important to point out that because you've experienced poverty, because you've experienced, all these adverse things at a young age, it doesn't mean, or even at an adult age, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the line for you. It doesn't mean that you have to be the person who has the circumstances that correlate with those negative experiences. So I was reading a little bit about the four building blocks of hope. And what I was looking at was having relationships is important. Not necessarily my boo, right? But definitely my friendships, my relationships with my neighbors and things like that. I was looking at the importance of having a safe, stable, not moving every few months, right? An equitable, having all the things you need to thrive environment. Safe, stable, equitable environment being an important building block. Also, social or civic engagement. And what that one made me think about was how many people ever take their children to meet local elected officials, right? Or to city council meetings, or to, just different things that affect the community or where they have input on what's happening in their communities, right? And so that was one of the things that inspired me to have my children uh, go with me to volunteer on a campaign so they could see what it looked like, to support a civic leader. So, and then the final one is social and emotional growth. So there are a lot of models that support social emotional growth in our communities. I know that CREM is one of them, the community resilience model, which teaches people how to determine when they're in the stress zone or when they're in the low zone, and kind of getting to that depression that you and I had talked about. And I think that it's important to focus on those four things. And I'm sure there are some more building blocks that could help people kind of thrive after those adverse experiences. What do you want to say about that?
I agree with those, because those four blocks definitely, it speaks to pretty much the whole person. It covers everything. It covers your personal life. It covers your professional life. It covers your spiritual life. It covers pretty much everything. I think that one of the biggest things is knowing that it's a huge undertaking to heal from trauma, where those who experience trauma, you're asking them to face it again. You know what I mean? And a lot of times people aren't ready to face that again. And who would? It's like, why do I want to think about what is hurting me, or what has hurt me, And so I think it's a very big step to take. And a lot of times when trauma is addressed, what isn't talked about a lot is most people aren't coming in their first visit to say, I need to heal my trauma. It's usually because of a hospitalization or from feeling, just overwhelmed and not understanding what's happening. You know what I mean? Very, and it's been more prevalent now because um, we are more in the space of talking about it more, and people are sharing their experiences more on social media and things like that. So people are more apt to come in and say, I feel like this right here. This person described exactly how I feel. And that's how they usually come into, the therapeutic spaces and things like that. And so I think all of those domains are very important, and when you feel really heavy in one of those domains, that's the time to start thinking, okay, what's really happening here? When do we start kind of taking that step back to see how my life has affected me, because you only know if it's an issue when you know it's an issue. A lot of times we don't know what affects us. We don't know why we do the things we do until something comes up and something happens, and then we have to reflect back and say, maybe this is connected to this, or having another person kind of realize that for us.
I think it's important for people to really take a second and think about the fact that what we said earlier, over 10 million children under the age of 18 are below the poverty line. And the reality is poverty today doesn't look like it looked back in the day. You knew poverty was the person under the bridge and that was the end of it, but you did not know that 20 people were trying to eat out of the same one pot, right? Or that there may or may not have been gas or electricity inside of the household where no one was under a bridge, right? And today, I think there's more awareness. I agree with you about the ability to share it on social media, to talk about it. The fact that people are really talking about some children don't have shoes to wear to school. And now we have a lot more clothing closets. We have a lot more food banks. We have a lot more philanthropic. Is it philanthropic or philanthropic? How do you say that?
I say philanthropy.
I say philanthropic. You know what? Today is both. It's going to be both. We have a lot of those efforts in our communities to make sure that these unseen poverty markers are being addressed. But I genuinely do believe that there should be some sort of automatic benefit, at least for children under the age of 5. And the only reason I say that is because during the core years, it is very important that a child has everything they need to thrive. I don't think that there's anything wrong with being resilient. Okay, let me just say that. I do believe that people shouldn't have to be resilient just to thrive. I think that people should have what they need.
Absolutely.
And still have the ability to be resilient.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you talking with me today.
You're welcome. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. I feel like I should hand out some sandwiches or something at this point from this conversation. But if nothing else, I am going to ask you, just based on the conversation that we just had, how will you just live?
How will I just live? I think how I will just live is to continue to be the change that I want to see in the world, which sounds cliche, but really utilizing my platform, utilizing my knowledge to not exploit or not, or to benefit from, but to always be in the space of supporting and helping everyone that comes across my path.
We love to see it. Um, I will just live by continuing to contribute to resources, access in the ways that I can. And for those of you who don't know, I have partnered with a local nonprofit. I do donate socks in bulk to agencies to support families who are facing homelessness or who have a need. So please do email me at qsqueensanaa@gmail.com if you know an agency or even a family or a community that does have a need for socks. It's getting cold out there. And I'm going to sign off on that note because I think we gave you all a lot to think about. There will be a lot of information in the show notes, and we would love to hear your feedback. So please do write into the Just Live podcast and share what's going on in your community. Let us hear your thoughts. Letitia is going to have information as well in the show notes for anyone who's interested in linking up for therapy or, a need in that space. So, Letitia, did you want to end with anything?
No, just thanks for having me. This is definitely a topic that is, well deserving of the public hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely agree with you. Thank you for coming today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Yes, you as well.
All right. Take care.
All righty.
As always, thank you so much for watching the Just Live podcast. I hope that you were able to get some information that was valuable for you and the work that you do and the community that you reside in. Thank you for watching the Just Live podcast. You can find this episode and others on Queen Sanaa's YouTube channel at youtube.com/C/QS Queen Sanaa. In the meantime, how will you just live?